Cześć, hello, vitam, and welcome to Pierogi to Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matalevich.
Early on the gray dawn of Saturday, October 12th, 1963, a rather oddly dressed, short, white-haired man, weary from thousands of miles of travel, and even more so in terms of the emotional miles, walked down an airplane to the tarmac at what was to become the John F. Kennedy Airport in Queens, New York. The last time he had seen this, his native soil, was over 2 decades earlier, and much had changed. Rising from the depths of the Great Depression to fight a cataclysmic world war, followed by a prosperous post-war boom, and giving birth to the Cultural Revolution of the swinging 60s, the United States had changed in ways that were to become soon apparent to the new arrival. For the 2 decades spent abroad by this individual, who were not on some sabbatical or extended holiday excursion. Held in captivity since the onset of the Second World War, and cut off from his family and any sense of normal human life, he'd spent this time languishing in the horrors of the Soviet prison internment system. With its network of infamous work camps, gulags, and prisons, the unimaginable suffering and death that permeated these facilities are widely recognized today as one of the greatest forms of inhumanity to have ever existed. Having been given up for dead, except by hopeful family members, some of whom stood waiting on the tarmac, he was now also greeted by a throng of reporters waiting to ambush the exhausted traveler, anxious for a scoop on the man's story, of which only scraps had so far been released. In the decades that were to follow, as the details of what transpired to him during his years of absence would be told and retold, it became apparent that his was one of the greatest stories of survival and faith to have occurred in one of the darkest periods of the 20th century. For this man was Jesuit Father Walter Ciszek, and his remarkable life is the subject of today's episode. The son of Polish immigrants from the town of Górno near Rzeszów in southern Poland, Władysław Józef Ciszek, popularly known by his anglicized name of Walter Ciszek, was born in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania in 1904 to a family of 13 children. Deep in the anthracite coal region, Walter was brought up in the tough industrialized world of turn-of-the-century America. By most accounts, he was a stubborn and troublesome child, with his father Marcin even dragging him once to a police station and threatening him with a reform school to try and knock some sense into him. However, this gruff exterior betrayed a depth of spiritual curiosity and conviction that the world would eventually know all too well. To nearly everyone's surprise, he decided to pursue a vocation as a Catholic priest. First studying at the famous Orchard Lake Seminary for Polish-American religion in Michigan, a chance encounter with the Jesuit retreat director caused him to join the Society of Jesus in 1928, even against the wishes of some of his family. But global geopolitical events were to shape the young curate's life from the insular coal region of his upbringing and any family disagreements. After centuries of adherence to Eastern Rite Orthodox Christianity, the Soviet Union's overthrow of the Tsar established itself as a publicly professed atheistic state, virtually outlawing the public practice of faith. In response, the Pope called upon his priests to undertake a dangerous mission to seek out and minister to the Christians summarily orphaned behind the Iron Curtain. Heeding this call, Father Walter undertook Russian studies at the Pontifical Russian College, colloquially known as the Russicum, in Rome, and was ordained in both the Roman and Byzantine rites in 1937. He was sent to a parish in eastern Poland in modern-day Belarus. Prevented from entering Russia by communist authorities, he held out the hope of someday entering Russian territory. When World War II broke out in September 1939, the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland gave him the opportunity at last to enter Russian-controlled territory and fulfill his call as sanctioned by the Holy See. However, not long after entering Russia, disguised as a laborer under an assumed name, he was soon arrested and charged with being a Vatican spy. Over the next 2 decades, he endured interrogation and torture in various prison and work camps, including several years of solitary confinement in the notorious Lubyanka prison in Moscow. While sailors kissed nurses in Times Square on VJ Day, Father Walter sat in seclusion, virtually unaware of worldwide events. Having been written off for dead by the Jesuits, it came as a complete shock when his whereabouts were gradually revealed in the 1950s. Following diplomatic negotiations in which a prisoner exchange was agreed to, Father Ciszek was released and returned to the U.S. after nearly 25 years. Thus sprung from his confinement, he readjusted to a world very different than the one he left, as well as the one he remembered. In the years following his return, he famously wrote 2 books about his life, With God in Russia and He Leadeth Me, detailing his amazing story of survival and faith. He continued to live as a retreat director and spiritual advisor, touching the lives of numerous people with his sanctity, humility, and kindness for the next 2 decades. Passing away in 1984 after several health complications, his cause for canonization was opened shortly thereafter, and he is currently recognized as a servant of God by the Church, and a first step towards hopeful beatification and sainthood. His remarkable life has served as an inspiration for those struggling with the question of suffering and finding a sense of meaning within it. His story is a prelude to our guest today, Father Michael Desjardins of the Society of Jesus, who is, like Father Ciszek, a Jesuit priest and has lived a remarkable life. A native of Massachusetts, but having grown up locally in Levittown, Pennsylvania, his entrance to the Jesuits coincided with Father Ciszek's return in 1963. Father Desjardins has spent time in South America, but is currently missioned to Tomsk, Siberia, in the same part of the world that Father Ciszek spent so many years. Due to his background in Russian studies, he was asked to translate some of Ciszek's writings for his canonization cause a few years ago, and through his ministry share some interesting parallels with Father Ciszek's story. I was privileged that during one of his brief visits to the United States, Father Desjardins was able to sit down for an interview. Our podcast, as well as its equipment, were still in its infancy, and much has transpired in the world since we recorded last October. Still, I think you will agree that our discussion of his knowledge of Walter Ciszek, as well as his experiences ministering to the same types of populations, was riveting. Although our talk was designed to focus on Father Ciszek, it evolved into a wide-ranging one touching on a variety of topics. There were some truly moving moments of the conversation as we recalled Russia and Poland's tragic past, as well as the difficulties facing his ministry today in a country once again plagued by war and oppression. It was a fascinating and enriching conversation, and one that I was beyond honored to have. Father Desjardins is a wonderful person to talk to, and he gave me a very personal insight to not just Father Ciszek, but the part that his story can play in all of us who struggle to find meaning in our broken world. I felt uniquely blessed by his presence and attention to our discussion. I am sure his warmth and kindness will come through in the words that follow. You can just start out by telling just a little bit about yourself. How long have you been a Jesuit? How did you come to be missioned out in Tomsk, Siberia?
I've been a Jesuit for about 60 years, and before I entered the Jesuits, when I was about 15, I started studying Russian. I lived in Levittown, Pennsylvania, and in the local newspaper, somebody put an ad about Russian lessons. So we responded to that and everything, and a few people showed up at this. It was at the William Penn Center, which was run by the Quakers. It was next to the Quaker Meeting House in Falsington, Pennsylvania. And the teacher was this elderly Russian man. And when I think about it, he was younger than I am now. He had been an officer in the Tsarist army and was sent over in World War I to buy arms for the Russian army. And when the communists took over, he just stayed in the States. So I not only did do some Russian, but got stories about old Russia, how it was and everything. But I've used in talking with people in Russia who are fascinated to hear some of these stories, you know. I was able to, as a Jesuit, to continue studying Russian. During philosophy, I was in Shrub Oak, New York, which is about 40 miles north of New York City. During the summers, 2 summers in a row, I was able to go to Fordham to continue my Russian study. And I did 1 summer at the University of Indiana. And then later I did a master's in Russian history at the University of North Carolina. And then at that time, I was also interested in, like Russia and Latin America. And I went to Chile in 1973 when there was a socialist government, Allende. I was there when they had the coup d'etat. And I really liked Chile. And I went back after I was ordained 14 more years, so 16 years altogether. And in 1990, I think it was 1991, when I heard that another Jesuit was going to be working in Russia, I wrote to our Father General, and he answered back and said, "Oh, okay, I'll send you to Russia. If the superiors in Chile and the superiors in what was then the Maryland province are in agreement, you can go." So I did. And I arrived in Moscow in July of 1993, and I was there a short time, and then I was in Tajikistan, a former Soviet republic, for about 2 months. And then in February of 94, I was sent to Siberia, to the city of Novosibirsk. And there I worked in what we called a pre-seminary program. I worked there for 7, 8 years, and then I was novice master for what was our Russian region at the time, the Jesuit Russian region, which also included Ukraine, Belarus, and all of the former Soviet Union. And after that, I went back to the pre-seminary program, and then in 2014, I was sent to Tomsk. Novosibirsk is the largest city. That's the largest city in Siberia. It's more or less the 3rd city in modern Russia. Tomsk is an older city. It only has 600,000 people. Novosibirsk had 1.5 million to 2 million. In Tomsk, well, in Russia, you usually have 1 parish in the city, if that much. Very often, the communities are very small. There just aren't that many Catholics in Russia. And in Tomsk is also a university city. There are a number of universities and institutions of higher learning. And of 600,000 people, 100,000 are students. And at our parish, we also have foreigners. Russia has, or at least Russian universities, have been trying to get foreign students. They even teach courses in English. And for instance, a fellow that I know from India, he studied medicine, and he said everything was in English. Also, there are a few young men from Ghana who were studying nuclear physics, and they also, everything was in English. One of the reasons is that apart from, a lot of these universities, most of them are state-run, and they get money from the government. If they have foreign students, that means that they get additional money.
Wow, that's fascinating, though. I always wish we could have met somebody like that, officer in the Tsarist army in old Russia. I mean, my God, he must have had some stories, too. So let's talk about Walter Ciszek a little bit.
Okay.
So you're currently working on his canonization cause, is that right?
Well, I'm theoretically one of the people involved in it. I did some translation work. So there was a series of documents that the Jesuit superior received from the former KGB. I translated that. Some of the things were just, little things that not very important. Like, for instance, in Russia, every time you ask for anything within the mentality, it's rather bureaucratic and stuff like that. You write a letter, and you write it to the person in charge of whatever department, whatever it is, and there's a certain way of doing it. So there are a couple of, one of these things was written like that, very formally, and asking to have his boots fixed while he was in prison. This was Father Ciszek. And there was another one asking for some books from the library or something like that. These little notes ended up in the files that were given over. But the most important document was in Father's writings. He talks about his interrogations and everything. And at the end of his interrogations, they had this document. It was supposed to be the resume of everything that he had said. And he had to sign the document. And he didn't want to, because when reading it, he said, I didn't say this. And they said to him, according to what he was written, he said, well, the interrogator says, well, that's how we interpret what you said. And they threatened him, and he signed. And the document, I had the photocopy of the document, and every page was signed. He had to sign every page. I don't know, I can't remember right now how many pages it was. And that's the document that, after he signed that, it was sort of a big turning point for him. Because he was hoping to convert his interrogators, that he could explain things and do everything, and at that point, he felt that he failed, and he went into depression, which was very, very serious. And then he just discovered that he was in God's hands, and it's God who was leading him. Like his second book, He Leadeth Me. That's when he learned that. God let him feel that strongly at that point, when he was very, very down and in deep depression. And, having translated the document, the interpretation of what his mission in Russia was all about, why he was sent there and what everything. Now, and then there are other things, like, for instance, he worked so hard in the last camp that he was in, and probably everywhere, where, he talked about working the best he could, because he was working not for the communists, but for God.
It's fascinating. I mean, we have his 2 books that he wrote, which is great to have essentially his firsthand accounts. I know he wrote it with someone else. But do you get, and I know you said you met him as well at one point. Did you get more of a sense of who the kind of person he was in going through these documents, and what kind of a man was he, like, just in a person?
I met him for the first time. I entered the Jesuits the 14th of August, 1964. And the next day, Father Ciszek took final vows in Wernersville, Pennsylvania. That's where he lived when he first came back from but at least I was present for his final vows, and we had a celebration, seeing him and whatever. And during my philosophy, when I was in Sherbrooke, New York, Father Ciszek was living at the John the 23rd Center, which is right on the border of the Fordham campus in New York. I bumped into him there a number of times. I remember they invited a number of us, I think 3 or 4 of us, who were interested in Russia and in the Eastern Rite, down to Fordham, the Jesuit community there, and the Jesuits in that community. And then there was one diocesan priest, Eastern Rite, who ended up working in Siberia, actually. And they were talking about the liturgy and how they do it, what they do, and things like that. This one father was talking about how he celebrated the liturgy in his apartment, and to have music, he used a recording of the music and stuff like that, because he was by himself. And another person said something about the liturgy, and another person, and then Father Ciszek, he says, Oh, when I was in the camps, I'd save some bread crumbs and have it in my pocket, and I'd have some raisins that we'd soaked in water, and I'd be working in the mud and everything, and I'd be all dirty and everything. And I'd wipe off my hand on my jacket, and then I'd get the breadcrumbs out, a couple of raisins, and squeeze the raisins on the bread, said the words of consecration, and receive communion. He says, that was my liturgy. That was my mass. It was so funny how everybody that had been talking about all these fine points in Eastern liturgy and whatever, and that's how Father Ciszek said. Oh, that's what when I was in the camps. That was my liturgy.
Yeah. not to one up you there, but here oh my gosh.
And I think another time he spoke about how this was after he was out of the camps and was living in the last place where he lived in Russia. He had a little shot glass of wine and some bread. And he was in this house where he was a boarder. He was sitting and, he'd pretend like he was reading the newspaper. And that's how we do his mass.
It has often been the case that the experiences of Polonia are seen in isolation or in something of a vacuum. Here in the United States, we see our ancestors immigrating mostly in the early 20th century and facing difficulties in industrialized America. However, what the continued conversation with Father Desjardins also revealed was that so many elements of the Polish diaspora found their way into the vast expanses of Russia beyond the Urals, sometimes as willing participants, but mostly as deported exiles from a stubbornly resistant people.
He talks about had to go and register at the police station, and as he was waiting, there's some people there, and they start talking. They said, one of the guys says, I noticed from your accents that you're Polish. I guess Father Ciszek had something in the way he spoke Russian, And he said, this guy says, we're Lithuanians here, and we had a pastor, a Catholic priest, who for our group, who just died. This particular incident has always struck me. Something that's not in his books. The current bishop, Catholic bishop in Uzbekistan, has a last name similar to yours, but not quite. It's Matsulevich. He's a Polish Franciscan. His father was Polish worker working in Russia, and his mother was actually Russian. And Father Ciszek baptized him and his little brother, and married the parents. They had not had a Catholic wedding. This was in Norilsk when Father Ciszek came out of the camps. And there's a meeting of Poles, and this woman showed his mother Father Ciszek's book in Polish. And she looked at it, and there was a picture of him. She looked at, oh, that's the priest that baptized you. And she told us this story of how Father Ciszek. She was with Ciszek twice at this baptism and marriage, and then he was with them at this meeting of Poles, and she was there, and she didn't know Polish then, and he translated for her, and she remembered that as as being very kind to translate for her, So those are two things that are not in the books that we talk about. So this bishop Matsulevich, he has a little crucifix that he got when he was baptized that maybe Father Ciszek made it, or he doesn't know. But so,
Wow. I mean, that's amazing. I knew this was going to be a great conversation, but having that, there's so much in taking this on and doing, and it's just, thank you for that.
I want to mention, that Father Ciszek's cause is sort of like slowed down. This Dutch Jesuit did a very good job of everything. And he told me, he said, we just don't have the documentation from Russia. And, one of the problems is that the archives are closed. The KGB archives are closed now. There were some things that were opened up, like in the early 90s, but now you can't get anything. But there's some pictures that have already circulated. The Claretian fathers, Polish Claretian fathers who were in Krasnoyarsk, they were able to get from the archives there some pictures, the mugshots. But anyhow, the thing, and this Jesuit, he said he was going to try to push the cause of Father Ciszek based on his reputation of holiness in the United States when he returned. But the cause hasn't moved forward. I heard that it was sort of slowed down completely, but I really don't know. I haven't heard anything official.
Any kind of uprising in Poland, whether it was the November uprising or the January uprising, 1863, a lot went up out there. I remember docking a ship one time, and there was a captain. He was Russian, and filling out the paperwork, and his last name was Mazurkiewicz.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Oh, Captain, that's a very Polish sounding name, Matulewicz." And he said that his grandfather or whatever had been sent out there in the 1860s.
Yeah, Well, there are Poles everywhere in the Russian Empire, and even in what is now Central Asia, these independent republics, like I mentioned this Bishop Matulewicz. He's where he is where the church has been restored, and it was beautiful spot in Tashkent, which is completely Asian, Central Asian city, and everybody's Muslim and everything. They began to allow churches to open in Central Asia, Catholic churches. First one was 1969 there were a lot of people who were exiled there. Yeah, they rounded up people, put them in boxcars, they carried what they could, and they dumped them somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the history of that region can be so painful.
So we've got people whose ancestors were exiled. Poles from from Poland was part of the Russian Empire. Towns that were basically Polish towns. There's one place they said that everybody spoke Polish in the town until the 1960s.
Wow!
And the one that's in our parish, it's really sad. A sad history. In 1937, the NKVD, which was the precursor to the KGB, they rounded up all the men, everybody 15 above, all the men, and they never heard from them again. The grandson of one of the men that was arrested at that time runs this museum in Tomsk, which is sort of like a history of the Stalinist repressions. How much longer that will be open, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because the tendency now is to whitewash Stalin because of World War II. Part of the national ideology now is the cult of Russian victory in World War II. It's Stalin at the head of that.
Yeah. I think there are modern political reasons for that one.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Yeah.
But this museum is still open, and it's very well done. Very well done. How many millions of people in?
So one of the things that always interested me about Father Ciszek, I think why I gravitated towards his stories. So he's from Shenandoah originally. My family's from the coal region as well. And then he entered the Jesuits and wound up in Poland and then later Russia. So working in that part of the world now, into Siberia, and knowing his story and kind of the stories we've talked about of these other Jesuits and priests over the years, do you feel a special connection there? Like, how does that, and you're a local well from Levittown.
Yeah. And where I grew up, a lot of people from upstate Pennsylvania, from the coal regions, and Lithuanians and Poles. The first place I actually met people who were Polish and Lithuanian background and whatever was there. The type of Catholic mentality, to see it present. And in Russia now, a lot of the priests who have come to Russia to work are Polish. And now I live with, when I first arrived, I was living, the Jesuit superior was Polish. And sort of a couple of other Polish, when I went to a couple of Poles. And now in the community I live in Tomsk, there are 2 Polish Jesuits. So I have more of a sense of Poland than
Yeah.
I don't know Polish. I can I've been in Poland 2 or 3 times, and after being there maybe about 2 weeks, I can start to understand more just through the Russian.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Written Polish, I can sort of decipher some. I can't really read it.
Yeah, it's a tough language.
Russian has an alphabet that's more suited to the language. And in Poland, using the Latin alphabet to try to reproduce some of the sounds.
Yeah, you get a lot of consonants thrown in that in Russian you wouldn't see. Do you think there's any particular lessons from Father Ciszek's life that are relevant today? I mean, there's a lot of people who've read his books and found this great connection with him. I mean, the Catholic app, they had He Leadeth Me as their book read last Lent, and it was a huge seller. So some people think he's still valuable, but what was in knowing a little bit more about his life and studying his papers? Is there anything that you've drawn from?
Well, I think that's what's impressed me the most. This complete dependence upon God's providence. I think that's the trust in God's providence.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he had quite a life. Every time I read his book, I get something new from it. And it's just, but yeah, there is that sense of come what may.
At this point in our interview, our discussion shifted from the past to the present. I was moved to take advantage of this opportunity to speak with someone living in a country that was growing more and more isolated due to its leaders' aggression and barbaric moves in Ukraine. Yet it also dawned on me that in discussing modern Russia, we were replaying an atmosphere not unlike that encountered by Father Ciszek as well. In a climate of constant suspicion and paranoia, under the threat of arrest and with brainwashing propaganda, Father Ciszek lived in Stalin's Soviet Union during a time, tragically, not all that different from Putin's modern Russia.
How have things changed, like as an American being in Russia now since the invasion? What's kind of it like on the ground out there? Like, what are people?
Well, where I live, we're far away, and the atmosphere sort of reminds me a little bit of quite a bit of the Vietnam War era without freedom of expression and freedom of the press. You can't, people that protest the war and everything are arrested and sent to jail. People don't talk about, they're afraid of, maybe this. And there are people that have fled the country, so as to avoid military service. About a year ago, they started calling up older people, and Putin has avoided sending people that are drafted to during military service into the war. So they've been using people that are on contracts, volunteers, and so forth. And there are people that left We have some parishioners and people will talk about the war and family tensions, whatever else. One old lady says, I was talking on the phone with my relatives from the Ukraine. And they just don't understand. We're only trying to help. And there's other people, it's sort of like the patriotism is very strong. It's sort of like in America, my country, right or wrong type of thing, and it's just just comparing, even though we had freedom of the press, freedom of expression during the Vietnam War and during the Iraq War, I think we're pretty well hoodwinked. In Russia, the propaganda, television propaganda especially, is just so incredible. I don't watch TV anymore. If people weren't in favor of the war and so incredibly in favor of the war and everything, they're patriotic. They love their country. And I think something that we have to look at too is, okay, you had the Soviet Union and you had Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and then you had the fall of the Soviet Union and the liberation from communism in Eastern Europe. NATO has gradually grown and expanded. 2014, Ukraine, there was a sort of a revolution, and they threw out the pro-Russian president. There was talk about joining the European Union, joining NATO. That's when Russia, it was just, they had finished the Winter Games in Russia, and Putin sent in troops to the Crimea, took it over. Well, Crimea, a very important naval base for the Russian Navy, and they had it even when that was part of Ukraine. And this invasion of the Ukraine is, that Putin is scared of NATO expansion, feeling that Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union, and part of Russian Empire, had never been independent before, and it was independent, and that they could all just become part of what Russia looks upon as a threat. I think something like that we have to take that into account. What's going on. It doesn't justify the war, I don't think. But in Putin's mind, it does. I mean, of course, they lie to the people and say that they're just Nazis, in Ukraine, and the president is Jewish. It's crazy.
Yeah,
it's crazy. Just what they accuse them of, but that the Ukrainians, more so than ever, now would want to join NATO. That's the sad part, and more so than ever are going to hate the Russians for the next 1,000 years.
Yeah, right.
By the way, in terms of Poland, when this war began, and there were a lot of refugees, all women and children mostly, that went into Poland, they didn't have any camps or anything. People just took them into their homes. I don't know if you've heard that.
Oh, I know. Yeah, my cousins and friends have. So
that's a big thing. We have the Jesuit refugee service, and one fellow, Ukrainian of Polish descent, is in charge of the thing in Ukraine, and working with the Polish Jesuits that are there. But most of the people were taken care of just by families took them.
Yeah.
As an American, I have not had any difficulties myself. There was another American Jesuit who had been in Russia only 7 months, was called in apparently by the KGB. We don't know who it was. Sort of like, your ambassador says that you should all leave. Why have you left?
Uh-huh.
So there's something like these bikers that have your name, and we hate to open the newspaper morning and find out that something had happened to you. That type of thing.
Yeah.
So it was sort of like an indirect threat, but a threat, and he left.
Well, yeah, I think I might too. If that was.
Although we see these things about Americans being arrested and everything, I hope I'm not on the list.
I hope not too. But and there's so much, misinformation here as well, about things over there too. I think,
It's sort of like in the cemetery, there were graves from the soldiers. A lot of the soldiers who, are people from villages where there's a lot of poverty. And if you sign up, it's good salary or something like that. There's signing up all sorts of people. There's one fella, a homeless person, about 60 something. He says, I was standing around somewhere and these recruiters came by and they want to recruit me. Somebody just uses cannon fodder,
Yeah. It reminds me of the waning days of the Second World War when Germany was the soldiers they sent into the Battle of the Bulge were, where they say schoolboys and old men. I think was one of the quotes. So 30. I don't want to take, but is there any kind of final, advice or that you would give or on Walter Ciszek or anything else that we've talked about? I mean, to include
Father Ciszek, I would say, his book "He Leadeth Me" is a real gem. With God in Russia is interesting, but he always says that the book he wanted to write was "He Leadeth Me." It's his spiritual experience. I really would recommend that. And it's something that it's not to be just read through. Something to read and think about and pray about and see how you can put it into practice in your own life, dependence on God's will.
Yeah. That's a tough lesson to learn sometimes.
Well, yeah, it certainly is. I mean, as Father Ciszek himself talks about how he was a young priest. He thought he could convert these KGB people.
The ending of our interview brought home a unique sense of sadness at the state that Russia and Eastern Europe finds itself in today. Even though it seems that so much time has passed between post-war Soviet repressions and today's world, the grim specter of totalitarianism and inhuman treatment is all too present. The willingness on the part of Polish priests to continue to work in the eastern reaches of the Russian frontier was yet another lesson in the unique character of Poles and our faith that I very much appreciated. In such troubled times, past, present, and future, the Christian message is one of hope in the face of death and defeat. It is also a reminder of the call of all people of goodwill to work towards the end of such situations in our world, and some in our very own communities. Those who work for social and political justice do the work of the gospel in concrete ways. The far-reaching effects of the Polish unique expression of Catholicism is at the heart of our St. Joseph's Apostolate's mission. Yet, as human beings, the temptation to allow the witness of suffering to bog us down into despair or fear is also very real. Perhaps this accounts for the enduring popularity of Father Ciszek's story. Namely, the call to keep in mind that we are entirely reliant on the divine hands that created us, and in this realization there is true freedom. Or, as Father Ciszek himself would put it, mysteriously, God in his providence must make use of our tragedies to remind our fallen human nature of his presence and his love, of the constancy of his concern and care for us. It is not vindictiveness on his part. He does not send us tragedies to punish us for having so long forgotten him. The failing is on our part. It is much easier to see the redemptive role of pain and suffering in God's plan if you are not actually undergoing pain and suffering. It was only by struggling with such feelings, however, that growth occurred. Each victory over discouragement gave an increase in spiritual courage. Every success, however fleeting, in finding the hand of God behind all things, made it easier to recapture the sense of his purpose in a new day of seemingly senselessness. No matter what my small sufferings are, I have a choice. I can either let them make me bitter, or I can meet them with the confidence that God will not abandon me. Over the past few months since first interviewing Father Desjardins, I've been guided to speak with several people who have studied, wrote about, and even knew Father Ciszek. These experiences, combined with my own reading, gave me a great deal of new privileged insights into Father Walter as a priest, but also as a person. Strange as it may sound, Father Desjardins' personality reflected some of the characteristics I've come to learn about Father Walter, not only as a Jesuit and a person who has traveled the world and ministered to so many, but as someone possessing a level of spiritual freedom and compassion that made you feel as though you were the only person in the room that mattered. Although I will never meet Father Ciszek in this world, except through his writings and the people he touched, my conversation with Father Desjardins was one in which I felt, at least in spirit, the closest next best thing. In lieu of the spirit of my interview with Father Desjardins and the topics covered here, we are forgoing our usual Polish Saint of the Month segment since we have highlighted the cause of Father Walter Ciszek so deeply, who we hope you will agree is a saint in all but name. If you, like so many, have been captivated by Father Ciszek's story and wish to delve deeper, I am pleased to announce the launch of a special initiative through our St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate. Starting in September later this year, the Apostolate will launch a program centering on a series of online presentations and reflections based on Father Ciszek's famous book, He Leadeth Me. The title of our program, With God in Camden, is an imitation of Father Ciszek's title of his first book, With God in Russia. Our 4-part series will take place once a month starting in September. Through online presentations and guided reflections, we will explore He Leadeth Me and reflect on the life of Father Ciszek with 4 amazing guest presenters. If you are interested in learning more about this program, stay tuned to our various social media pages and the Cathedral and Apostolate websites for links where you can find registration information. You can also contact us at the podcast email address, pierogideprayer@gmail.com, for more information. The wide appeal of Father Ciszek's story and the interest that has already been expressed in this event is greatly encouraging. Please spread the word, and if you or anyone you know is interested, we invite you to prayerfully consider participating in what promises to be a deep experience of spiritual renewal. As always, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you use. We will be posting more information on Father Ciszek, as well as ways you can help spread the word about his cause on these pages. If you enjoy our podcast, also please leave us a review, as this greatly improves our exposure and visibility. More so, we also just love to hear from you, and what we are doing well and what we may do better. And with that, until next time, salte some pierogi and go sit with a saint. Dziękujemy, thank you, and do usłyszenia.